cottages sprang up everywhere, but mostly they were crowded all along Winthrop's beaches. And by the way, did you know that Winthrop once had its own little railroad, which ran around town in a big loop, bringing people to and from Boston? It was called the narrow gauge. Because its tracks were small and it used tiny little engines and cars, there were many stations all through the town. And before there were buses and cars, the train was the only way for people to get from place to place. This little railroad played a vital role in developing our town of Winthrop into the thriving community it is today.
That was good, Audrey. It was well thought out. I especially like the mention of the narrow gauge. In fact, I had been planning to talk to the class about the railroad as part of our local history study. So, with Audrey's very nice introduction, perhaps this is as good a time as any. Now, how many of you even knew that there was a train that went through Winthrop? Not too many. Well, you may have heard your grandparents speak of it if they've lived around here, because it was quite popular in its day. And as Audrey mentioned in her essay, the railroad really did help develop Winthrop. Now, if you have heard of it, you've probably heard it referred to as the narrow gauge. But does anybody know what the real name of the railroad was? Yes, Charlie?
The Boston and Maine?
No, Charlie, not the Boston and Maine, though that's a good guess. No, the real name of the railroad was the Boston, Revere Beach, and Lynn Railroad, or the B, R, B, and L. And it was a very important railroad. In fact, Winthrop probably wouldn't be what it is today if that railroad hadn't been built to take people in and out of town. The history is really quite fascinating, too. I think it'll make an interesting subject for discussion and study. Maybe we'll take a field trip around town so you can see where the railroad used to be. Did you know it even ran right out behind our school here? If you look out the window... The railroad certainly was important. As a point of fact, it was without question the single most important factor in the development of Winthrop. And for many of us who remember it, those trains were a part of our lives that we'll never forget. Those barking, puffing little steam kettles were woven into the fabric of our daily routine. But to one 6-year-old girl, it was the essence of a very special day. June 23rd, 1928, my birthday. My folks were taking me into Boston by train. It would be my first time for both. But of all that day's special events, the circus, a toy from Jordan Marsh, and lunch at popular Thompson Spa, it was the train ride that really stood out. The trip was full of curious little events that stuck in my mind, like the kindly conductor presenting me with a token gift of a railroad spike. And that curmudgeon sitting behind me with his foul-smelling cigar. I often wondered how he knew I was watching him through that newspaper. And then there were those other nameless faces, people I had never seen before, going God knows where. I knew they were not there for my birthday, but maybe it was their own. And little did I realize that day, but the men I saw stringing wires along the track were beginning to convert my little steam railroad to electric operation. Within 4 months, the steam locomotives would be gone, replaced by quieter, but much less fascinating, electrically powered trains. My first steam train ride on the narrow gauge would also be my last. But from that day on, it was enchantment. The beginnings of what many would say was a rather offbeat inclination for a little girl of decent upbringing. I really liked trains. big ones and little ones. Now, what do you suppose I picked for that birthday present from Jordan Marsh?
Elizabeth, lunch is ready. Elizabeth, I said lunch is ready. Wait a minute.
Although my mother strongly objected, it was pretty certain that I'd be working on the railroad someday. In the years to come, long after the narrow gauge had become just a recollection, and I had embarked on a somewhat less romantic career, I revisited the BR&B&L. Spending many lonely nights in the upper rooms of the public library, I was determined to learn all that I could about this diminutive railroad that gave a small girl a really memorable gift. During the course of those on and off research binges, I did learn a great deal about the railroad and the town that had grown up around it. What I began to see was a complex history, an evolution of railroading enterprises and mergers, land developers and entrepreneurs, and bitter rivalries, equaling on a small scale the feverish land and railroad boom taking place all across the country toward the end of the last century. Railroad, the one we called the narrow gauge, was by no means the only railroad to run through Winthrop, just the most famous and the last one. It began operation in 1875, running the 8 miles between East Boston and Lynn. But it didn't officially enter Winthrop until 1888, when the famous Winthrop Loop was completed. But during those 13 years in between, Winthrop was the scene of intense railroad competition, with as many as 5 other railroads, all trying to lay their tracks through Winthrop's 1.5 square mile area. In fact, someone had even proposed a monorail system for the town. It's hard to imagine now, but nearly every corner of town, at one time or another, was accessible by train. The railroad wars were in full swing, and the spoils of the war was Winthrop, with its potentially promising shoreline. The Boston Revere Beach and Lynn Railroad and all of its predecessors were to comprise a fascinating and little-known drama, a drama that was played out in our town's formative years. So try to follow, if you will, this rather complex story. The years after the Civil War had brought some remarkable changes to America. Technology was entering every facet of life, and transportation seemed to be in the forefront. To the traveler, the world indeed was getting smaller. During the 1860s, Winthrop was a rural farming suburb of Boston with fewer than 600 people and nearly inaccessible by land routes. Until a toll bridge was built across the Belle Isle Creek, it was a 2-day round trip to Boston with horse and wagon, by way of a great circular route through Revere, Medford, and Cambridge. But once this bridge was built, stagecoach service began, and so did a modest influx of people, many of them traveling to the new Taft's Hotel at the tip of Point Shirley. At that time, the coastal areas surrounding Boston were vast stretches of barren marshland. To realize the full potential of this land would take a real visionary, and history provided one. Alpheus Blake of Hyde Park, who was then president of the Boston Land Company, which owned the wastelands between Boston and Lynn. To develop this area, he surmised, an economical, easy-to-build 3-foot gauge railroad was needed. Thus, in 1875, the Boston Revere Beach and Lynn Railroad was born, with Blake as its first president. The BR&B&L began operating along a single track with 3 locomotives and 1 ferry, the Union. which brought passengers from Rose Wharf across Boston Harbor to a terminal at Jeffreys Point in East Boston, where the trains to Lynn were waiting. Alpheus Blake's plan was twofold: to provide commuter transportation between Boston and Lynn, but more importantly, to develop his coastal land in between. Although it was not a part of his immediate plans, Blake always kept a careful eye on the peninsula of Winthrop. But in the meantime, other things were developing in town. 2 years earlier, the Winthrop Horse Railroad was formed and had begun service as a replacement for the old stagecoach line between East Boston and Winthrop. These were the first tracks to be laid through the town, the first of many. But the Horse Railroad was only modestly successful at the outset. It carried its patrons from East Boston, along Saratoga Street into Winthrop, down Pleasant Street, and since Washington Avenue had yet to be filled in, the route took a sharp turn down Winthrop Street to McGee's Corner, where the horse barns were located. Then finally down the total length of Shirley Street to the Taft's Hotel. 3 years later, however, in 1876, the Horse Railroad went bankrupt and was sold for $12. The new owner was Samuel Irwin of Winthrop. His plan was to replace the horse cars with a steam railroad that would follow a different route through Winthrop. And since it would also be narrow gauge, it could connect with the BR&L at Orient Heights, which incidentally was called Winthrop Junction back then. Incorporated as the Boston, Winthrop, and Point Shirley Railroad, but affectionately known as the Peanut Train, Irwin's tiny railroad, with a single locomotive and 5 employees, opened to the public in 1877. As Winthrop's first real railroad, the Boston, Winthrop, and Point Shirley carried passengers from Orient Heights, across Belle Isle Inlet, down through McGee's Corner, and across what's now the golf course. It then cut a curving path through barren sand dunes toward the beach. Around the base of Cottage Hill on a precarious trestle, and ended in the middle of what's now Euro Beach. Later plans called for terminating at a new steamboat pier further down near Otis Street. Late in 1880, another railroad with the ponderous name of Eastern Junction, Broad Sound Pier, and Point Shirley was incorporated to tap Winthrop from the Revere side and was intended to be purely a summer excursion line. But since it was such a short-lived operation, the history of the Eastern Junction Railroad is wrapped in obscurity. Only a few details and even fewer photos exist. In fact, it's pretty certain that no regularly scheduled trains ever ran on this line, at least not while it was called the Eastern Junction. Beginning at Point of Pines in Revere, the Eastern Junction used standard gauge track, 4 feet 8 inches wide. This allowed them a direct connection with the Boston and Maine Railroad. The Eastern Junction tracks followed a path that paralleled Revere Beach, cutting across what's now Elliott's Circle, where it rose up on a huge trestle to cross over the BR&L's tracks. It was here that the Eastern Junction also built its world-famous Great Ocean Pier and dance hall. Upon entering Winthrop through Beachmont, the Eastern Junction then followed a route near the water's edge along what's now Sewell Avenue. The route then passed along the water, crossing Shore Drive, finally ending near Shirley and Beach Streets. This section of town, once a barren beachland, was known as Ocean Spray, and had recently been developed into cottage lots by a Winthrop physician named Samuel Ingalls. Now, the Boston, Winthrop, and Point Shirley's narrow gauge tracks already passed through this area on its route from Orient Heights to Point Shirley. Since the Eastern Junction also needed to complete its route to the point with their wider gauge track, the two railroads reached an economical solution. It appears they solved the problem of the different track widths by laying a third rail to form a dual gauge track. Now both railroads could operate to Point Shirley using the same tracks. Unfortunately, the Eastern Junction's financial footings were not as solid. With their funds dried up, the Eastern Junction could ill afford to operate any trains over the new line. It was now 1883. Alpheus Blake's prosperous Boston Revere Beach and Lynn Railroad had still not entered Winthrop, though nearly everybody else had. But his narrow-gauge railroad had unleashed an explosive exodus of city dwellers, all wanting relief from the simmering congestion of urban life. Revere Beach was their oasis. Its waves and breezes were a safety valve for those oppressed souls. Some came to live by the sea, others just thankful for a visit. Meanwhile, back in Winthrop, our two friends, the Eastern Junction and the Boston Winthrop and Point Shirley, had formally merged. This new venture, with a new name that sounded like all the rest, was called the Boston Winthrop and Shore Railroad. Winthrop's can of worms was finally getting straightened out, but further problems and setbacks awaited. On Thanksgiving Day, 1885, after 2 years of successful operation, a fierce nor'easter devastated the line and tore up the trestle around Cottage Hill, thereby reaffirming the fact that, as much as he tried, man could not always conquer nature. With this disaster, all train service to Point Shirley and the steamboat pier was ended. Now the trains could only run to Cottage Hill Station at the foot of Fawn Bar Avenue. As the Boston Winthrop and Shore was in the process of restructuring its trackage routes for Winthrop, it was as well desperately trying to remain solvent. By 1886, the Boston Winthrop and Shore was ready to finalize its route through Winthrop. Various new reroutings and additions to the existing route had been proposed, then discarded. When the dust had settled, the BW&S had decided to build a large loop through the town. The line would still enter Winthrop from Orient Heights, following what's now Morton Street. But with the new loop starting and coming together again near Reed Street. In order to avoid purchasing any more new property than necessary, the railroad built a portion of this new route on trestles, crossing the water out into Crystal Cove. But by now, with its financial base crumbling, the Boston Winthrop and Shore, by necessity, was absorbed by the solvent and all-powerful BR&L. Alpheus Blake's railroad had finally gained its long-awaited foothold in Winthrop. By 1888, the now famous Winthrop Loop was completed, the one that many of us would recall so well. With its newly acquired branch line through Winthrop and 9 new stations spotted around town, the BR&L settled down to years of prosperity and growth.
Tickets, please.
When the station at Winthrop Center was being built in 1888, some workers digging in the foundation came upon a rather gruesome sight. They had accidentally uncovered an ancient Indian burial ground. That station, by the way, was located where French Square Park is now. In 1902, as Winthrop celebrated its 50th anniversary, the entire BR&L route was being made double track. Now trains could come and go more frequently, at 10-minute intervals and around the clock. A trip from Winthrop to Boston now took just 45 minutes. The narrow gauge was exclusively a passenger-carrying railroad. It had always been an efficiently run and progressive thinking operation. For example, in 1879, only a few years after Bell had invented the telephone, the BR&L was the first railroad in this country to use telephones instead of the telegraph to dispatch trains faster.
Express southbound.
Even the great Pennsylvania Railroad didn't use telephones until 17 years later. And all was well during the early 1900s. As the first public bathing beach in America, Revere Beach had flourished to become an amusement park and tourist center of national scope. All combined to entice the city dwellers and vacationers to take the train. By 1907, 4 million people a year were doing just that. And the towns were doing just fine, with populations and property values reaching all-time highs. In 1911, in a modest burst of colonialism, the BRB&L purchased a newly built trolley line running from Delby's Corner near Washington Avenue and Shirley Street down to Taft's Avenue at Point Shirley. Appropriately named the Point Shirley Street Railway, this new line had been recently built by the wealthy Ridgway family of Revere Beach amusement park fame. Point Shirley was once again provided with rail service for the first time in 26 years. (1912). Over the horizon, the Titanic has sunk. But something else is beginning to stir. Henry Ford's new assembly lines are proving to be an unqualified success, a portent of things to come. But for the moment, at least, all seemed well. So well, in fact, that the railroad had even planned to widen its track and extend its route out to Salem and Peabody. But these proposals never materialized either. Nonetheless, an incredible 20 million people were now riding the narrow gauge trains each year. These were the glory days. During those banner years, badly needed new equipment was purchased. New Mason locomotives, Laconia coaches, and finally some more modern ferry boats. Oh yes, these rugged little vessels were a story unto themselves and provided yeoman service equal to that of the trains. Although on occasion, they were known to become lost in a fog bank and head out to sea. But derailments, striking unions, and even our legendary New England winters didn't hinder the railroad very much. Every effort was made to keep them running. But throughout these trials and tribulations, the little railroad was developing character, a distinctive personality all its own, and the patrons loved it. By the 1920s, however, cracks appear in the armor. Automobiles are making definite inroads. Ridership is dwindling while operating expenses are rising. The Point Shirley trolley line is dismantled. Buses have shown that they can do the job more cheaply. Noisy steam engines, pot-bellied stoves, and gaslights are now an anachronism. By 1928, realizing the time to modernize has come, the BRB&L, now under new management, moves to begin electrification. The General Electric Company is contracted to build the overhead wire network and the necessary power stations. No more need for costly steam locomotives, since the old wooden coaches themselves would now be self-propelled. Fitted with electric motors, trolley poles, and headlights, they become like subway cars. New seats and paint jobs complete the transformation. By November of 1928, a rebirth. The new narrow gauge is in operation with 60 coaches converted to electricity. Hopefully, a faster, quieter, more efficient railroad will increase ridership. The tracks are also modernized, with a trestle around crystal coal filled in with earth and stone to better withstand the ravages of weather and tides. Even the engineers themselves are spiffied up. Denim coveralls are traded in for natty broadcloth and brass. They're now called motormen. To many patrons, however, the old narrow gauge was dead. As if to underscore this sentiment, a funeral-like procession of B&M flat cars leaves Lynn one day, carrying 24 small steam locomotives to their graves. The railroad now has the distinction of being one of the only narrow-gauge railroads run by electricity. But the bleakest of times are still ahead. While Prohibition is in full swing, doing a fine job of darkening everyone's spirits, Wall Street is experiencing financial tremors. October 28, 1929, Black Tuesday, has caught many by surprise. The years that follow are incredibly lean and trying times, even for an economically streamlined railroad. Wages and services are cut, and the few remaining night trains are replaced with borrowed trolley cars. One more backbreaking financial straw comes in 1934, when the Sumner Tunnel is open to automobile traffic. The Sunday driver can now take his car to work. No more slow ferry rides for him. Finally, when the great hurricane of 1938 destroys much of its right-of-way, the BRB&L is ready to throw in the towel, succumbing to both the errant whimsy of nature and to the changing technology that ironically should have helped it. Already in receivership, the BRB&L makes only the most expedient repairs to the storm-damaged track. In October of 1939, a petition is filed with a federal court, and permission is granted to liquidate the Boston, Revere Beach, and Lynn Railroad. While many citizens groups, particularly in Winthrop, are petitioning to forestall the abandonment, the Rapid Transit Bus Company has already begun service from Winthrop to Orient Heights. When the ferry Brewster makes its final trip from Rose Wharf to East Boston on that blustery January night in 1940, it ironically carries more people than ever before. More than 900 pushing, screaming individuals, some on a frenzied souvenir hunt. But others, especially those whose livelihoods depend on the railroad, are in a more somber and reflective mood. Their narrow gauge days are over. Records indicate that a Mr. Walter Mills of Winthrop had the distinction of being the very last passenger to board the Brewster. Once in East Boston, the crowds from the Brewster split up, some for the Lynn train, but most boarding the Winthrop-bound train, though all seem struck by one realization: their beloved railroad is in its final moments. Minnie and Snooky, the company cats, are given their last meal at the railroad's expense. Conductors Lester Tarr on the Lynn train and Joe McCarthy on the Winthrop train signal their departures. One by one, with their motors humming, the two trains entered the short tunnel under Summer Street, and then all was still. The Boston, Revere Beach, and Lynn Railroad endured for 65 years. But in the 40-odd years since its passing, nature and man have had ample time to alter its landscape. Precious few vestiges remain of what used to be, and those that do require a knowledgeable eye, like these concrete abutments that were used to support the overhead wires. Along the rural countryside of central Pennsylvania, at a tourist railroad called the East Broadtop, several BRB&L coaches can be found, still riding the rails. And here in Winthrop, another little-known fact, one of the original railroad stations still exists. Long since moved from its original site, the first Thornton Park station was long ago converted into a private dwelling. And from Wonderland Station to the airport, today's MBTA Blue Line trains run over virtually the same route once used by the narrow gauge. But what about those earlier railroads? Those ancient, forgotten little pikes that preceded the narrow gauge more than a century ago? Virtually nothing remains of them, but there are a few clues. Backyards with an odd angle, and streets with a peculiar curve. Streets where it's nearly impossible now to even imagine a railroad having been there. Streets that now carry a far less romantic mode of travel. All things will pass, and it is usually the case that such things are not missed until they're gone. But for some reason, the narrow gauge had a quality about it, a charm. In this instance, we did seem to realize what we had, even before it had gone.